Hey everybody, and welcome to the last episode of June of 2022. This is the Wednesdays with Watson podcast, and I am Amy Watson. By now you know I'm your host. It's just us today, as we talk about a little bit about season 3, as we are definitely nearing the end of this season. And so we have a lot of new listeners and a lot of new followers, and so I just wanted to spend this fifth Wednesday in June. This is a month that we have focused on racial trauma. And so we'll talk about those episodes a little bit in just a few minutes, but it's also PTSD Awareness Month. Now, this is a podcast that focuses primarily on post-traumatic stress disorder, and we have spent 60 plus episodes talking about PTSD. And so that is why I wanted to use the month of June, which is when we observe Juneteenth, and really segueing into July, which is it's Mental Health Awareness Month for people that are Black, Indigenous, or people of color. And so that is why I wanted to invest every episode during the month of June, because I know some of you are catching up on the podcast and you will actually hear these episodes in July. And so I learned a lot, guys, on the racial trauma series, and we're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But I would love to do a little bit of just kind of an update on where the Wednesdays with Watson podcast is, where it's going, and how you possibly can help. But before we do that, for those of you who are new here, there are many episodes in this season that you may find helpful, and so I would love to tell you about them. When it came time to do season 3, so season 1 is a season called PTSD, Jesus and Me, and that is a season, especially early on. As a matter of fact, I think the only guest I have on that podcast are Chrissy, who is on episodes called The Memory Keeper, my friend Cheryl, and Chrissy Walk of Baylight Counseling, and my counselor, Dr. Pettit. But for the most part, that first season, PTSD, Jesus and Me, was my opportunity to get behind a microphone and share my story and my journey about share my journey, I should say, with PTSD, including and leading up to the diagnosis and really how life has been after. Started the podcast almost immediately after the pandemic. Started in April of 2020 because I was bored and didn't have anything else to do. And really my own PTSD was incredibly activated on so many levels. I did not feel safe. I didn't feel any of the things that's important for PTSD patients to feel. And I was laying in my hammock one day and looked up to the sky and literally said to the Lord, "Now what?" And he said, "About that podcast that your friend JT has been telling you to start." And so I went in my house, got out of my hammock. I was super comfortable, went in my house and bought a microphone on Amazon before the whole world did, and started that podcast. And so that first season, I said in the very first episode, Healing That Doesn't Make Sense, that this podcast would evolve, that it would grow, and that I would grow. I didn't have any idea, though, that first season, PTSD, Jesus and Me, would be as cathartic as it was for me. And just getting behind the microphone and sharing with people who wanted to know how can I live? How then shall we live? When it comes to things like PTSD. And so that first season, in the show notes, I'll click it where you can find kind of the whole season together. And then the second season was PTSD, Jesus and You, and that was mostly the stories of other people. There is an episode in season 2 called This Is My Story, These Are My Songs, and it was the last public place that I shared some intricate parts of my story. And unless God tells me differently, it will be the last public time I did. And my friend Phil Baker, who has his own podcast, came on there and sang many of my favorite songs as I shared my story. And so that is season 2, PTSD, Jesus and You, is a story of other people. And we covered everything from medical PTSD on there to losing a spouse or losing a child. And also another season when we had a couple therapists on. And so that's PTSD, Jesus and You. And so when it came time to do season 3, I did not want to pigeonhole ourselves into just post-traumatic stress disorder, though that is what I have and what I'm studying and what I'm writing on. And I write for the Complex Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Foundation. So it is a lot of what we talk about. But moving into season 3, I really, as a person, grew from wanting to help the whole world to wanting to provide access to help to the whole world. And so when I said in that first episode, Healing That Doesn't Make Sense, that I would evolve to, that is what I mean, is that I know that there's nothing I can do from behind this mic to actually help you, but I can provide you access to help. And that comes ultimately through the star of the story, who is Jesus. And everyone who has ever listened to any part of this podcast knows that. So when it came time for season 3, I wanted to continue to be more practical. I wanted to provide access to some resources that would help people as they navigated through trauma. So we've called this season Traumas, Places, Spaces, and Aces. And so we started with an ace. And so the first 9 episodes, and even some before that, there were a couple of Enneagram episodes before these 9 episodes, including an interview with my own Enneagram coach, Carissa Harrison. And so we used that as a framework, if you will, the Enneagram, how God made us, because I wanted people to understand that you are going to respond to trauma differently based on the way you're made. And we could have picked any number of personality tests, Myers-Briggs, Strength Finders, any of them. But I happened to pick the Enneagram, and that didn't sit well with some people because there is some scuttlebuff on the Enneagram, but I decided to use it as a framework to help people understand why they might respond to trauma or avoid trauma, as is the case with Enneagram 7s. And so the first 9 episodes are interviews with, Chrissy is with me on the mic. And so the first one, our type 1, was represented by my friend and best-selling Christie Award-winning author Becky Wade, and she represented our Enneagram 1. I, of course, came in and represented our Enneagram 2s, and our 3s were represented by my friend, and also she's Christie Award-winning author Katie Ganchert with 3. Enneagram 4 was Rachel Odom, who is now just somebody who I love dearly, but I came to know as a result of this podcast. She represented our 4s. Sophia Walsh represented our 5s as she talked to us about surviving thyroid cancer. And that interview was incredibly fascinating, especially as it pertains to the way she was built and needing information the way Enneagram 5s do. Enneagram 6 was represented by Chrissy Lothridge. If you've listened to many of these podcasts, you've heard her on the mic with me before. And so she was our Enneagram 6. Enneagram 7 was my friend Angie D., and that was a phenomenal episode, and really, really probably the one that fit this topic the most, because Enneagram 7s do not like to deal with emotional issues. And so that we called that one Sitting in Emotional Pain, and Angie shared with us how she did that and how she's on the other side of some of that stuff. And as a matter of fact, just got engaged, and so that's really exciting. The Enneagram 8 was represented by my good friend and one of my 2 a.m. friends, Jennifer Dunlap, and that interview blew my mind because she was so knowledgeable about how God made her, and she herself too had used the framework of the Enneagram. And then the Enneagram 9 was represented by my friend Joy Tiffany, and another really powerful interview. She prepared for it so much. And so all of these episodes, we asked the same questions, and one of them being, how can we do life better with people that are of your personality type? And the answers to those were really, really, really helpful. We then moved into some sciencey stuff, and we began to talk about, we went to the places and spaces portion of the season, and so we picked the home, and we picked childhood trauma, so the space being childhood trauma, the place being the home, several interviews of people who lived through childhood trauma, and some hope and help there. And then, of course, for the month of June, we moved into the racial trauma, and I tied that into children, trauma that children in Black and brown communities experience that other communities wouldn't even know about. And so the first episode on that one was Tiffany Countryman and Malikia Courtney, who had some really, really powerful examples of trauma that they experienced as children that I, as a white person, never in a million years would have ever thought of. And so really good episode. They opened up the month for us, Tiffany Countryman and Malikia Courtney. Next up, we had TJ McKnight, and TJ's interview, incredibly powerful and incredibly helpful, because I asked TJ a very important question on that interview, and that was, what can we do? really not wanting to make a group of people who have been harmed my professor, but I didn't know any way to do it. And so I was so grateful that TJ came on, and his answer to that was quite fascinating. And so his episode is worth a listen for sure. Then we interviewed Jenya Wren, who Jen and her husband Jim adopted 2 biracial children when they were in their mid-40s. And so we talked about the dynamics of raising biracial children in a family that is culturally different than these children that you adopted, and how the community receives you, how the Black and brown community receives them, and what her greatest fear for these children will be moving forward. And so another episode really, really, really worth the listen. And then the caboose of that series was an interview with Dr. Katherine Jackson, who it was really important for me. And those of you who have listened to the podcast and have even heard me just kind of do a recap of the podcast since it started, knows that it's really important for me to provide education for you, and not just for me, even though I can teach you some things from experience and study. I always like to have therapists on. And so it would have been really a disservice to have a podcast on racial trauma and not have a Black therapist on. And so Dr. Katherine Jackson comes on, and we talk through all of those racial trauma episodes, and she comes at us from an educational standpoint, because it does not equal therapy, but she comes at us and helps us understand even more these traumas that these guests shared with us, and why is it important to listen like TJ told us. And so her interview kind of caboosed that interview on racial trauma. So we're not going to be dropping every week, though. Moving forward, we'll go back to every 2 weeks for the remainder of season 3. And we don't have much left in season 3. This season is quite longer than many of the seasons that we've done in the past. But coming up are a couple fun episodes with, one of them is with my friend Nicole, who is a guru on the connection between mental health and food. And so we talked about that in the context of children and the importance of properly nurturing them with food. And she tells us her story, very powerful story, has tried to leave this planet many, many times, and thankfully was not successful, and absolutely every day struggles with her own mental health diagnoses, but has really become, like me, a mental health advocate. And so she talks to us about food and the connection between food and mental health, as well as her story. Really, really cool and informative episode. And then the next episode after that will be with a chef whose name is Chef Kibby, and he has his own podcast called Connecting with Cooking, and he is a foster parent, and he came on to tell us how he realized how he could speak into these traumatized children's lives in the kitchen, just by asking them something simple like, hey, will you cut up some onions for me? And so he has created a whole ministry of when he brings these children in his home to connect with them in the kitchen. And so that episode will follow Nicole's. And then bringing up the rear of this entire season will be Dr. Thomas Pettit, and then a final episode from me, and then we will move into season 4. I'm excited about season 4. I'll be making some announcements about season 4 pretty soon. There'll be some changes around here as there's some life changes going on for me. But I picked a topic that, when I look at all the podcasts that we've ever dropped, this topic is top 2 or 3 most important topic that people go back and listen to. For some reason, it just really resonated with them. And so we will be doing a whole season on this particular topic. So you guys will have to wait for that. A little bit more, we have officially awarded 2 scholarships for pro bono counseling based on the fundraiser that we had at Christmas time and merchandise sales. We hope to award 3 more in 2022. We will be dropping a new line of merchandise, so if you're watching, follow me on Instagram and you'll find out when that happens. I post mostly in stories there, but also static. But if you follow me on Instagram, I promise not to drive you crazy, but that is where you'll find that merchandise, and that does go to fund our mission of providing hope and help to people who can't afford it. And so we do hope to be able to award a couple more scholarships before the end of the year. And so I hope that you have taken the time to invest in this series and listen to these people who may not look like you. And even if they do look like you, help us all be part of that complete sentence that one of our guests said simply, change. And do we want to be part of the change? I do hope that those of you who did listen to the racial trauma, or who will go back and listen to the racial trauma series, will understand my heart in that and be able to lean into a community that you may not understand. Or if you're in that community, I hope that you will feel loved, that the Wednesdays with Watson podcast cares about everybody. But I felt very called to do this entire month on racial trauma because you matter. And so exciting things going on around here, and more on that in other episodes. And so as we end the month of June, I hope that you guys have a fabulous July 4th. We will be back here and on schedule 2 weeks from today. Until then, you know what I'm going to say, and I mean it with every fiber of my beating heart. You are seen, you are known, you are heard, you are loved. So valued. You guys have a great one. See you in 2 weeks.
Let my life glorify you and teach me to walk